Anti-American protests continue to ricochet across the Middle East and South Asia today, turning deadly in Pakistan, where 3 people were killed today. Protests throughout the region have now claimed at least 33 lives since they began nearly 2 weeks ago. NBC News foreign correspondent Ayman Mohadeen joins me now from Beirut. Ayman, tell us what's happening there, because Hezbollah, of course, which is a large part of the government in Lebanon, had called for large demonstrations. What's happening today?
In fact, they did. It was the largest protest they've called to date, and it happened in a place here known as Baalbek, just in the Bekaa Valley. Thousands of people showed up. It was relatively peaceful. Here in the heart of Beirut, there was a counter-rally, a rally that was organized, rather, by Sunni Muslims, and that, too, was relatively peaceful. About 2,000 people showed up. What you're seeing across the Arab world, particularly in countries like Egypt and here in Lebanon, as well as in Libya, are protests denouncing that
taxes. That's according to Mr. Romney. Well, Romney's remarks at a private
political figures to denounce the type of violence that we saw against the U.S. Embassy and other U.S. facilities around the Arab world. So you get a sense that the situation, at least now, is being contained. People are still upset about the caricatures that appeared in the French newspaper, the film, but they are now trying to move these types of protests away from facilities and diplomatic missions because they do harm the national interests of these countries.
And Ayman, I know you know Cairo so well. You're based there frequently. President Morsi is coming next week for the UN meetings. And I've been told that the State Department, at least, and other top officials, including members of the Senate, are very pleased with his subsequent response after the very tough phone call from President Obama, that they in fact insisted on keeping the Cairo embassy open last weekend rather than taking Washington's recommendation that they close it after the initial protests, that they feel that he really is trying to deliver, and it's very, of course, in his interest, because he is desperate for American and international financial help. So he's looking to make a big splash here in New York next week, meeting with top bankers, with top finance officials, and he is really trying very hard to stabilize Egypt.
Absolutely. You know, one of the ways that it's being described is that President Morsi now finds himself between marrying the anger that sometimes erupts on the streets of Cairo with the national interests of the country. You know, he is now responsible for 80 million people. He understands that a great deal of helping Egypt get back on its feet economically has to deal with its diplomatic efforts. You know, a week before these protests erupted, you had about 100 or so businessmen from the United States representing some of the best and most powerful American corporations coming to Egypt to invest billions of dollars in Egypt. So there's no doubt that the Egyptian government is fully aware that it is in its interest right now to maintain a close relationship with the United States. They also recognize that the people protesting do not represent the vast majority of Egyptians, do not represent the vast majority of Arabs, and they are trying to now at least give the people the right to protest, give the people the right to be upset, but at the same time prohibiting any kind of violence that can jeopardize Egypt's diplomatic and economic interests, which again pour in and serve the interests of the Egyptian people at large.
Ayman, thank you very much for that. In fact, to your point, I was told that many of those CEOs from General Motors, Coca-Cola, other major corporations left only within 24 hours of the protests that turned so violent in Egypt as well as elsewhere. Thanks, Ayman. And new details are emerging surrounding the fatal attack on the U.S. consulate in Libya, shedding new light on the crucial hours that led up to the death of Ambassador Chris Stevens and 3 other Americans. Joining me now is Michael Leiter, NBC News terrorism expert and former director of the National Counterterrorism Center. Michael, thank you very much. The first word that it was, quote, terrorism, likely terrorism, came from Matthew Olson, your successor at the Counterterrorism Center, in his testimony the other day, then followed up by extensive briefings and a lot of anger and criticism from Capitol Hill. We heard from John McCain and others. What we now know indicates that this protest may have just been masquerading or a pretext for what really was a fairly well-organized, pre-planned, not spontaneous attack, and perhaps the video was not really the spark plug.
Andrea, first, on the point that it is terrorism, I think that's pretty clear, and from my perspective, it was pretty clear over the past week, even right after the event. But we have to remember that that's a fairly precise definition that Matt Olson, my successor, was using, which involves a sub-state actor with politically motivated violence. Again, there's really no doubt that that's what occurred. The harder question that they're still trying to figure out is what exactly was the motivation? Who was behind it? Were they affiliated or aligned or motivated by al-Qaeda? And how long before the event was it actually planned? And I think those are the issues. We can accept it's terrorism, but all those other important questions still have to be answered.
I want to show you a graphic of the compound. We've seen this in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. And what we're learning now is that the annex where at least 2 of the Americans, the former Navy SEALs were, and other Americans, was a half-mile away. And that for a variety of reasons, the Libyan government had not been told of that location, could not participate in the rescue, didn't have GPS on it, that the Libyans did not know how many people were in country, so didn't know how to properly evacuate them. It seems as though there were a lot of steps that caused other problems. They didn't have at the main building, didn't have fire extinguishers, didn't have masks. Were they properly prepared for this kind of attack, given the fact that there had been several earlier incidents that were clear warnings?
I think normally consulates, which are not in the capitals as opposed to embassies that are in the capitals, are often not as well protected as their larger cousins. And I think the case here in Benghazi was just that. It was a smaller compound, far fewer armed guards, and that made that defense process much more difficult. In terms of the response and where Americans were and how many there were, I have to say it's not at all surprising to me that people were unclear on that night about what was going on. Here we are more than a week later, and we are still trying to piece together the details of what happened. Trying to figure out in the fog of one of these attacks, in an area where the Libyan government certainly controls the ground but doesn't have a heavy security presence yet, is very, very difficult. So as people moved from the consulate to the safe house, as the Libyan forces attempted to move in, the fact that they would not be sure where people were and what the attack was going on, I actually think that's expected. Now, again, whether or not they had the precautions in place before the attack, again, I think that's something that the State Department and the intelligence community are going to have to dig into.
And what do you say to John McCain and others on the Hill, Susan Collins, who are sharply critical? And, I mean, McCain yesterday came out, he was blistering. He said he learned nothing from the intelligence briefing that they had. He said that he'd read more in the public media that was accurate about what happened. He said that the administration was completely naive to be blaming this on the video.
Well, you may not be surprised. Although I served in a Republican and Democratic administration, I am sympathetic to the executive branch's challenges here. If they say too much, something may well prove wrong in a couple of days, and they can be skewered for that. Hence, they generally say very little and just what they know, and there are lots of rumors out there from Libya, from the press. So it seems like they're trying to hide things. I think they are being cautious. I think that's wise, because every day more and more facts come out. Again, I think what we see is in Benghazi, the security situation is still very, very uncertain. Did that consulate have enough security? Were we prepared for what was at least a somewhat organized attack and follow-on attack? Those are the questions we're going to have to ask, and I think with the death of 4 Americans, it's pretty clear that something did go terribly wrong.
Michael Leiter, thank you very much. The fog of war and these kinds of attacks, obviously very, very difficult to sort out what went wrong. Hillary Clinton has, as is mandated, established a review board, and they will presumably find out more. Thank you, Michael.
And
what more can be done, should be done to protect our diplomats? We'll talk to the former U.S. ambassador to Kenya, who survived the 1998 al-Qaeda attack. Next on Andrea Mitchell Reports.